This department here is one of the first, perhaps the first department in the United States in applied mathematics. So in that sense, Brown was pioneering.
The origins of Brown University's Division of Applied Mathematics can be traced back to the early 1940s. When the United States government called on the American academic community to help address the lack of applied mathematicians needed for the war effort, Brown answered the challenge by starting a summer program that evolved rapidly due in part to the availability of leading applied mathematicians fleeing persecution in Europe. By 1946, Brown had established the Graduate Division of Applied Mathematics, followed by the addition of the undergraduate program in 1950. Since then, the division has gone on to make significant contributions to the exponentially expanding fields of applied mathematics through the work of a faculty consistently comprised of highly distinguished members.
I had been working in Washington at the National Bureau of Standards.
Whenever I would travel, people would say, "Oh, do you know Phil Davis?" Because he was really famous for those early contributions to what became foundational in computer-aided design.
But I always wanted to write.
He was one of the pioneers in what was called spline theory.
A friend came by and told me that there was an opening at Brown.
Splines are mathematical functions that are still very much in use today.
I'd heard that Brown was a top-notch place in applied mathematics.
Design of vehicles, cars, airplanes, and so on.
I said that if I go there, I'll be able to write. And that turned out to be the case, and I've written constantly.
But also for making individual characters in a font, in a character font.
I taught undergraduates for a number of years.
The outlines of the characters are expressed as splines.
Oh, I put up a terrible fuss. Oh, I don't want to retire, and so forth, so forth.
Phil did some of the very earliest fundamental work in that.
My retiring from teaching was the best thing because then I could write.
And also graduated some of the pioneering PhDs who carried on the work. One of the last remaining mathematicians who could be said to know most of mathematics.
I'm putting something together that I hope eventually get published. It's called Personal Impressions and Brief Lives from My Mathematical World.
I think everybody who has known him holds him in that incredibly high esteem as a very special person.
Phil Davis taught a class on differential equations that he did a derivation out on the board, and he showed the same thing in two different ways. But it was so nice and it was so charming that when he finished his demonstration, the class burst out laughing. It was the only time I had that kind of experience where you laugh with the sheer joy of seeing something mathematically beautiful.
Phil had connections with a very broad cross-section of university faculty in these days, so people from the humanities and social sciences were always guests in his house. So in his house I met all sorts of different professors from Brown.
This department was built up by the president of Brown, Riston.
Okay.
Riston. There were a lot of refugees from Hitler that were great mathematicians, physicists and so forth. And he invited him to come to Brown. That's why this department was started up by one of those people. His picture is up there on the fireplace, Willie Prager.
That's the founding father up there, William Prager, and I came to Brown in 1958, then I was in the math department entirely.
Wendell Fleming is an amazing researcher.
Was brought here by Herbert Federer, who was a really excellent mathematician.
Wendell Fleming and Harold Kushner, they are pioneers in this field.
So then Harold and I, of course, have been for years and years and years, had this kind of partnership in our group.
Harold Kushner's, I believe it was the 60th birthday conference that was held here, and I was completely astounded by the broad range of fundamental contributions he had made, influenced broadly the area of stochastic control, risk-sensitive control with applications to math finance.
We had some excellent students.
It was recommended to me that Brown is one of the top schools in applied math, so I thought, I would apply here.
All of these students, of course, came back to Brown after serving in other departments.
So after I was a graduate student here, and then I left, I went to Bell Labs, and then I became a full professor at Carnegie Mellon University.
Kavita Ramanan.
And as I often say, Providence struck. And I came here, and I haven't looked back since. It was an extraordinary experience.
And Paul Dupuis, who were also students here, left for a number of years, and they came back when they were already senior members of the department.
These successful PhDs would come home to the division because of the valuable mentorship opportunities available with world-class mathematicians such as Ulf Grenander, a promising statistical mathematician recruited by William Prager as part of the effort to expand into research areas that were in high demand by technology industries.
Ulf Grenander was my thesis advisor.
Don McClure was Ulf's student.
Ulf came from Sweden.
A Brown graduate who stayed here after graduation.
We had a large class. There were about, in 1966, about 20 new graduate students that year.
We expanded in the areas of numerical analysis. We always had this very original program in stochastical mathematics, which is probability, but not classical probability or classical statistics. That was represented by Ulf Grenander. But he was, in a sense, alone because he was so original. So that field flourished later, perhaps in the 1980s, 1990s, when the younger people like Stu Giemann and Don McClure and so on.
So I was a student at MIT.
The first major addition to the group was Stuart Giemann, who came to Brown in 1977.
We were doing a reading course together, and he mentioned these technical reports from the Division of Applied Math by Ulf Grenander on a subject called pattern theory. And I was curious, and I read them, and I thought, that's really interesting. I want to go talk to this guy. So I got in touch, and I came down, and we spent, an afternoon in his office, getting excited, both of us. And he said, as I was leaving, he said, why don't you come down tomorrow and give a seminar at noon? So everything was so informal that they had come up with a job description. So I told the other places no, and I came here.
In a sense, they were Ulf's students in that they accepted his philosophy, scientific philosophy.
He seemed to agree that these structures cross cognitive boundaries, that when you play chess or do math or language or just have a conversation, you're using the same principles of representation. Mathematically, if we're going to capture it, we have to capture variability. So there's a peculiar combination of very structured, combinatoric, and very random, probabilistic or stochastic. And it's that combination that is exactly pattern theory. That's what he wanted to put together.
The attraction and the influence of Grenander that really started it, but it's been a very strong group in the division.
Around those days, Larry Surovich came to be at Brown, and he put together what is still the Center for Fluid Mechanics, and still a strong piece of that sort of classical physics that this division has always been good at.
Mechanics and probably statistics were really sort of the main things here in the division in the early days. And there's still, mechanics stayed on, and in its current incarnation, it's still doing well, but there was this opportunity. One of the big events in the life of the division was 1964, when the group headed by Solomon Lefschetz came here, which is now evolved into the Lefschetz Center for Dynamical Systems.
So they brought dynamical systems. Of course, this is a part of mathematics, differential equations of evolution. In other words, differential equations that describe how things change, how the state of a system changes with time.
The division of applied math is itself a dynamical system. Its state changes, on occasion over relatively short intervals of time. In 1964, as Brown celebrated its bicentennial, the division experienced major change with the arrival of a distinguished group of scholars led by legendary mathematician Solomon Lefschetz. Born in Moscow and raised in Paris, Lefschetz had emigrated from Europe in the early 20th century after excelling with his studies in chemical engineering.
And he came to the United States to work as a chemical engineer, and there was an industrial accident.
And I think a heavy power cable fell across his arms and he lost both hands.
So he could no longer do chemistry.
Then he went on to be he had these artificial hands, which he write at the blackboard.
He got a PhD in mathematics anyway. It's a long story, but he became one of the leading American mathematicians.
First in very pure areas of mathematics, geometry and algebra and things like that, and then later he got interested in differential equations and so on.
He was Princeton, and he retired in the early 50s. And since he had this connection with Russian mathematics and command of the Russian language, he decided to do something about this lack of communication between American mathematicians and the developments of mathematics in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, that was what Martin later became Martin Marietta, I think, was sponsoring it.
Certainly it was one of the major airspace companies here in the United States.
He set up a group in Baltimore.
A research institute in Baltimore.
It was an institute called RIAS.
Lefschetz collected a number of young, promising American mathematicians. In the early 60s, Martin Marietta was tired of supporting theoreticians somehow.
In about 1963, they decided it was time to move to an academic setting.
Brown needed a group to move in.
Truel, who was by then the head of the department, was a personal friend of Joe LaSalle, who was part of the Lefschetz group. They'd known each other during the war, done some kind of war work.
So negotiations were made, so Joe LaSalle, who was the leader of that group, moved that group here to Brown.
And so they brought them all here, and it was a really, really big change.
Joe LaSalle came, Jack Hale, Harold Kushner is the only person who came as part of that group and still around here.
Lefschetz himself continued to live in Princeton, but he came once a week. So he was the founding father, if you want to say that, and Joe LaSalle was kind of the person who orchestrated making things go there. It had a strong worldwide reputation and all. I think some people in other countries thought it was a much bigger organization than it really was. It was a huge adjustment for the division, though, having all those people show up with very different styles, very different way of going at things. Actually, much more mathematical than had been applied math could mean a lot of different things, all under that name, but it was a big adjustment.
Adapting to change requires stability and strength. It could be said that the division's firm foundation owes some credit to the extraordinary setting that has been home to applied math for over 65 years. The building, originally constructed as the estate of Henry Pierce, a successful self-made Providence businessman. Brown was able to purchase the building in 1953 as a home for applied math, and it has played a role in the division's development ever since.
So I came down and I was already blown away by the building. I have to say that played a big role for me. I came down, I gave a talk in room 110, which is spectacular, of course, and that really got under my skin. It made me want to, what a great place to be. Well, Ulf in the building, not take anything away from Ulf, but what a terrific atmosphere. And I think it does promote a camaraderie and a collaborative atmosphere.
A very important feature here of this department here is the building itself, because the building is like a home, and this had more or less enhanced the opportunities of social interaction. Well, you have the feeling that you live in a house with a kitchen and so on.
The serene environment of the Pierce estate would go a long way in providing some much-needed sanctuary while the outside world became more turbulent as the times they were a-changin'.
There was a period during the Vietnam War, a lot of racial tension also. It was the late 1960s up to about 1972, which was a very turbulent time in universities. The one thing connected with all this activism, where it seemed like Joe got caught, had to spend a lot of time and effort he didn't want to do, was in May of 1970, was after the Kent State thing, there were these super urgent meetings, got to do something. And at the end of one of those meetings, there was a motion on the floor of the faculty that we vote to end all military funding of research, which meant funding from the Defense Department. This would have profound implications for the Division of Applied Math. So the usual way that you deal with that is you table the motion and appoint a committee. 9 months later, people were worried about something else.
On one of two times, I learned a very important lesson, which is if you get up and stand on your chair and defend some sort of thing like the new curriculum very strongly, you will certainly become a member of some committee or another that is supposed to run it. And so I did that and became chairman of the Modes of Thought Committee, and Tom Banshoff and I taught one of the very first of the Modes of Thought courses.
Modes of Thought courses were introduced as part of the new curriculum initiative at Brown, but ultimately did not continue. What did continue, though, was the growth of scientific applications for rapidly advancing computing capacities, and the division took on the mantle of research and education in the field.
The division started to form the scientific computation group and the group of probability.
Talking about the time you were chairman is sort of like talking about the time you were in middle school and all the drama and all that went on in middle school. But still, one thing stands out was the fact we were able to bring David Gottlieb here. There's an area of scientific computing, the use of applied mathematics as a tool toward solving large-scale problems in science and engineering, medicine, whatever. I mean, weather forecasts or whatever you want to think.
So my father was David Gottlieb, and he came to Brown in September of '85. I was doing my homework on the kitchen table, and my father looked over my shoulder and he said, "Oh yeah, that's what I do." And I said, "I don't care, I like it anyway." So
David Gottlieb was here, and then Chi Wang Shu came in the late 1980s. So scientific computing was growing very rapidly in the 1980s.
my father was extremely happy at Brown. He loved his colleagues, and the students were spectacular, and it was just a wonderful atmosphere. So he was very happy here, and he ended up being here until his death in 2008, December 2008. He was actually teaching a class till his very last semester. In terms of building up the scientific computing group, my father worked to bring in different professors who are still there now. The scientific computing group in the Division of Applied Math is very well known now. It's one of the top in the country. And that was not the case before he went to Brown.
As time went on, the division continued to validate its status as a top program with a track record of pioneering new paths and consistently contributing to the field, as evidenced by the world-class talent it continues to attract.
In the 90s, David Mumford came to Brown from Harvard.
David Mumford, who is a major mathematician, seriously world-class, one of the top, 10 mathematicians in the world.
That was very significant.
And also participate and contribute to that program in stochastics that Brown had pioneered somehow, Wolf had pioneered.
He was a close collaborator with, in research with other members of our group, Grenander, Stu Gieman, and postdocs who were here and things like that. So that was very significant.
David Mumford has had a huge impact in bringing in a broad range of tools to very applied problems, looking at vision. And as a, as a pure mathematician who's moved to try to emphasize the importance of applied mathematics.
Mumford really wanted to come to Brown. He really liked the collegial environment at Brown and how easy it was for a faculty member to collaborate with colleagues in a different discipline. So he could work very closely with people in applied math and with people in cognitive science and with people in neuroscience at Brown. The departmental boundaries just were not an impediment.
And he's also very passionate about math education. I met him around a month ago, or 3-4 months ago, and he was still asking whether we are doing enough first-year seminars, and he had started this course to try and bring in more and more people, to increase the public understanding of mathematics.
One realm that emerged in the field of applied math is an application of such potential that over time it would develop into a technology with societal influence of unprecedented magnitude in human civilization: computer science. As such, its time at 182 George Street was a brief but critical period of gestation enabled by its two parents, the divisions of applied mathematics and engineering.
Turns out I have the second PhD in computer science in this country.
I remember Andy. Andy was a little older than I when I arrived here.
I said, well, eventually I'd like to have a department of computer science.
These were indeed, of course, heroic days for computer science.
All schools eventually are going to have these departments.
Computer science was developing very rapidly.
At the time, there were only 2 or 3 in the country.
And Andy himself was full of energy.
The vibe of the place.
He had many young people, young students.
And particularly this emphasis on undergraduates.
There was extreme activity upstairs.
I started teaching computer science courses within applied math.
Of course, access to computers was limited.
A couple of years later, John Savage came to the Division of Engineering, so then we had 2 groups.
So people had to work here 24 hours a day.
So it was a joint program between the 2 divisions.
When these people decided to leave the division
in the early 70s, started talking about, well, what about an actual department of computer science?
And formed their own department.
And it took more years than we thought it would.
Some of my colleagues were apprehensive.
But eventually, we were allowed to have a program in computer science.
In a sense, they felt that would be sort of a betrayal to the department.
Morris Glicksman against considerable opposition.
But of course it was inevitable.
From the 2 divisions.
That field was growing so rapidly.
Allowed us to become a full-fledged department.
Directions that would take it far from the center of applied mathematics.
And at the time then I reported jointly to Jack Hale, who was the chairman in applied math, and to Rod Clifton, who was the chairman in engineering.
It was like the birth of something new, of a new era.
Computers and mathematics, of course, are inextricably linked, and the new millennium gave rise to more opportunities to further establish Brown's status as a world-class institution for forging new paths of collaboration, such as ICERM, the Institute for Computational and Experimental Research in Mathematics, which was established in Providence after Brown successfully competed for one of 6 grants from the U.S. National Science Foundation.
So the mission of ICERM is to increase the impact of computation in mathematics and vice versa. We focus on areas where computation can facilitate new mathematics. We focus on areas where mathematical development can impact algorithms that are used in computation. And many of those things also impact the application areas. So the interplay between mathematics and computation is at the heart of everything we do here. I think ISERM is a very natural outgrowth of what's been happening in the Division of Applied Math for many, many years. They worked on bringing in different subject areas, different application areas. They worked on making mathematics and computation and applications harmonious with each other and help each other and symbiotic with each other. And ISERM just does all of that on a larger scale. Really, ISERM is taking what my father worked toward in life and it's enlarging it and giving it more impact. People who were involved in the proposal for ISERM at Brown were people who my father thought very highly of. I think I'm carrying out my father's values. Open research, talking to people, being generous about giving credit, educating students to help reach their goals. All of those were values I learned from my father and that are important to me, and I think I'm doing that. My father's legacy, those are big shoes to fill. I do think that the division is carrying through my father's legacy, and that makes me feel very good about it.
Although just scratching the surface, these highlights in the history of Brown University's Division of Applied Mathematics form a pattern of pioneering and progress with a trajectory that one could extrapolate into the future as having very good odds for continued success.
In the entire country, I think the number is around 120 mathematicians who are members of the National Academy of Sciences. And so we had Mumford, Stu Gieman, Wendell Fleming, Ulf Grenander, and Konstantin de Fromos, all 5 members of the National Academy of Sciences, which says something about the quality of the faculty and the high regard that the faculty in the division are held in.
I feel like I'm a member of the last generation to have the old academic environment. I do think it was very special. I didn't worry about, I was a physics major as an undergraduate. I took a lot of math. I went to medical school, not because I wanted to be a physician. I just was curious and poking around. And so I was raised, I guess I'd say, as a scientist. And it wasn't with the pressure to focus, the sense of urgency that students have now. And that I've just watched that develop over the last 40 years, that change in attitude. And it's not that students today, some of my colleagues will say, students today, they're not really interested. It's not that at all. They can't afford to have the same sense of things. I mean, the world has gotten very small and they feel the competition.
I certainly hope that the spirit of collaboration, of freedom, intellectual freedom, and respect of a broad range of topics from very pure mathematics to very applied mathematics, and an interest in having influence on real applications. This whole broad spectrum which this department represents, I think, is largely due to the founding emeriti and their vision. And I certainly hope that this will continue forward in the future. It certainly is an ethos of the department, and I certainly hope that, I expect that it will continue forward.